Research Center at the University of Vermont. It is my pleasure to introduce another former student this semester who has turned into a wonderful transportation engineering professor. I'm Dr. byAultman-Hall, and Dr. LaMondia is here with us today. He's an assistant professor in civil engineering at Auburn University. Received his PhD in transportation engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. Before that, he was a student at UConn, where both Dr. Homain and I had the pleasure of having him in our classes, which is dating us. His expertise is in the development and application of discrete choice models, and of course, here on the University of Vermont campus, he is famous for being the co-creator of the longitudinal survey of overnight travel, which he will talk to us about today. It was a study funded by the UVM Transportation Research Center's UTC grant that ran in 2013. Not only is Dr. LaMondia a great transportation and discrete choice modeler, he's also evidently a great teacher, because in 2014 he won Auburn University's Walker Teaching Award for Excellence in Engineering Education. He's also active in professional service, and both Dr. Lee and I bump into him very often on our favorite committees at the Transportation Research Board, including, of course, the Bicycle Committee, which Dr. Lee and Dr. LaMondia do a lot of work for the paper reviews on. So we are so pleased to have you here today. Thank you for traveling from Alabama.
Well, thank you all very much for having me. I was thrilled to be invited to come up and talk to you about our LSOT project, and I'm sure many of you have heard about it in great detail. You'll be getting some more detail from me here. So what I want to focus on is kind of some bigger pictures about why we're looking at long distance and overnight travel. And as Lisa mentioned, my background is very much in the modeling side of things, trying to understand how people move around regions. And so I'll talk about the applications of this into those types of frameworks. And of course, I'd be remiss not to start off by thanking everybody that was part of the project. I think all the UVM folks are in the room with us here today, so thank you all. Lisa, Chester, and Jim, of course. I have a team of graduate students back at Auburn, which is in Alabama, who have been helping me analyze all of our side of things and digging into the models and annual time travel, which we'll get into in just a little bit. So Ben Bacon and Travis Gaikowski have been really helpful with that. And developing the survey itself was RSG based here in Vermont. Okay, so as I said, there's two main goals that I want to cover today. The first is trying to describe kind of the role of long distance and overnight travel, with a focus on its involvement in predicting regional growth and regional patterns. And the second thing is, how do we accurately account for this long distance and overnight travel within those frameworks? And spoiler, we're not doing a very good job of it. But to start off with, what's the big point of this and where it came into being? Well, I started looking at long distance travel back when I was at UT Austin. As part of my dissertation, I really dove into the leisure vacation side of things, because it's a huge industry. We spend billions of dollars building facilities, generating activities for people to come and do in areas, but yet we don't really have a good sense of how people are moving around the US, the world, and predicting how these things will happen. So we've got 2.6 billion long distance trips that are happening each year. Back in 1994, there was about 24% of all person miles traveled, and if we can argue that's grown considerably since then. And just the number of long distance trips by personal vehicles is huge as well. And there's a number of implications for it. When I give talks about this in Alabama, we are very much into building roadways and expanding our roadway capacity. So their interest is really on the interstate system and trying to make sure that our interstates are going to match the needs in the future. We have a lot of aging populations, not just in Alabama, but across the country, that getting them connected, especially rural and urban areas, is important, because we see a lot of the older generations moving outside of the city cores. We need to make sure that they have access, which may involve long distance, probably not overnight, but long distance trips. And my big interest in all this comes in the growth of mega regions, which you may have heard this phrase. Across the country, people are watching different regions to say, you know what, these cities are starting to connect to each other, and we don't just operate within our city limits. We're extending them, and we can commute between major metropolitan areas. But unfortunately, our methods up until today don't account for this type of travel. So you could be doing leisure things, work activities. Unfortunately, Vermont doesn't really show up as one of them, but I have seen versions of this map where all of New England just gets lobbed together. I happen to think that may be a southern approach to it. But I will mention that even Auburn is just, we're down here, this is Atlanta, and so we're sort of by proxy included in there as well. So this is one way to kind of describe the role of those long distance trips when it comes into big picture. And kind of gets into the idea of how we collect this information as well. So we can think about all of the travel that goes on in the US in 4 different categories. We have day trips that are happening locally. We have day trips that are more long distance, and we define long distance many different ways. In the United States, we typically refer to it as 50 miles or more, but different cities and regions use like 40 miles to 100 miles. Europe uses very different standards as well. But we can also start looking at overnight travel. And so we can have overnight within a localized area, or overnight travel that's a longer distance away where you may hop on a plane or go somewhere like that. Now where we get this information is a little biased, where we have the daily information is rather well collected using the National Household Travel Survey, that's the NHTS, which many of you have probably worked with some of that survey data. And it captures a lot of the daily travel. It typically asks questions about what's going on over a 24-hour period. And you can see the scale of those types of trips. These come from the most recent NHTS, which was the 2009 NHTS that came out. And you can see the number of trips and the number of miles by different scales, both local and long distance. But they don't do a great job of capturing these overnight trips, and that's where our longitudinal survey of overnight travel comes into play. That's the acronym LSOT for it. And you can see the scale of trips here. We did not capture 5,000 trips in here. What we did actually to generate this, these are trips for our study regions, which was Alabama, Vermont, and California, mainly the Davis region. But we scaled those trips and the associated miles for each of them to give you a sense of where do these long distance and overnight trips fit in to the whole picture. So even though the overnight trips are fewer, you can notice in terms of miles, they make up a huge portion of how people are moving around the United States. So if we're trying to, in the Alabama sense, make sure our interstate system is built up enough to support this travel, we really need to make sure we're paying attention to these trips. Now, the way that I introduced this to them was with the interstate system, and I went back through all of that information and said, okay, if we start looking at the miles traveled for each of these different categories, but only focus on the car trips. We can throw out all the air travel, the rail travel, and say that for a given mile of interstate, now granted this is a bit aggregated, but you can see what the proportion is for those different road types. The daily local and the daily long distance trips are covered by the National Household Travel Survey, and we use that information to look at how people are moving around the region pretty well, so we're capturing them. The overnight local trips are rather small in the grand scheme of things, but there's a 15% of all the travel on our roadways that's being missed by our National Household Travel Survey. So if you were to set up a radar gun or one of those counting radar or tubes out on the roadway, you'd be counting these cars, they're part of what you're seeing, but when it comes to the data that we use to predict what's going to happen 20, 30, 40 years in the future, we're missing this 15%. We just don't have the data to describe what's going on. So we're probably under-predicting this type of travel. Now what I did also was I took our longitudinal survey of overnight travel and compared it to the 1995, or excuse me, this is 2001 actually, the 2001 National Household Travel Survey, to look at specific trips and how they've changed over those time. So I'll get more into how we collected the LSOT data in just a bit, but I want to give you a sense of scale of how these things were changing. That not only are we missing that 15%, but I'm going to argue that we're missing even more as time goes on because these are changing. So what we have here are in-state and out-of-state trips compared between the LSOT, which is 2013, versus the 2001 National Household Travel Survey. They only asked a short period of time, about 3 weeks of travel, of overnight trips or long distance trips that you had done. So you can see in terms of the out-of-state trips, those are increasing between 2001 and 2013. But the in-state trips, when we're talking about these overnight trips, have decreased considerably over time. So people are not traveling very much in-state overnight travel, and it kind of supports the idea of the mega regions, that we're going further and further out and crossing state boundaries. When it comes to purposes and duration, though, we have a shift here as well. And you can see on one side it's the 2001 National Household Travel Survey, and the percentage of trips that are happening for different time periods. We've got 1 night, 2 nights, 3 to 7, and more than a week. And you can see they're shifting much more into the higher durations between 2001 and 2013, that our overnight trips in the higher categories are increasing. Okay, so let's talk big picture about why we care about this. Well, this turned interesting. These are supposed to be green, yellow, and red. And so I wanted to show you a little bit from Auburn, Alabama, which is where I'm from. This is our metropolitan planning area. The university itself is located right downtown here. And this is our 2035 plan, projecting out where we expect congestion to go. And PBS&J actually is the consulting firm that used National Household Travel Survey information to develop this. So they're not thinking about these overnight or really long distance trips through the region. And you can see that this is the do nothing option, where if we left the roads to fend for themselves in 2035, that a lot of them are going to be a poor level of service. That's the red categories. So we're trying to understand how people are moving around this region well. And in order to do that, they break up the region into a number of zones. In fact, what we were just looking at is only this little area right here. They ignore the rest of the Lee and Russell counties. They're not part of the planning region. And you can think about wherever you are, we have to draw these arbitrary boundaries. We can't just model for these huge spaces. There's no time or computing capacity to do that. So we have to restrict them somehow. And so the travel that's happening is really focused on the travel within this area. Now I love this graph. This is also another place that I've been. You're getting a little bit of history of me. This is Austin, Texas, and they broke up the downtown area. You can see the black indicates different areas that they're concerned about, and the movements between them are highlighted by these lines connecting the different neighborhoods of downtown Austin, Texas. The thicker the line, the darker the red, means more people are moving between them, and that's the process that we use for figuring out these traffic patterns. Unfortunately, you'll see here, just as like you saw in the Auburn, Alabama example, is that the lines don't extend beyond these boundaries. We focus on these core areas, and we kind of ignore the stuff outside. That anything outside often just gets ignored. Or there's a moving trend just summarizing them as external trips, that we count the number of people that cross the boundary and we leave it at that. That we're not really concerned too much about where they're going or where they're coming from. But there are a few places like Ohio, the state of Ohio's DOT is doing some good work with their destination specific, that they obviously are not trying to predict where people are going across the country, but they've broken it up into different geographies. There's a neighboring state geography, then there's the regional geography, and finally kind of the rest of the country geography. So it's a step in the right direction. But most places are ignoring outside this boundary. Well, what's the process for doing this, and how can we improve it to look at these longer trips? You may be familiar with the 4-step planning model. That's one that's often taught in classes. It's kind of, we used to call it the traditional 4-step model, but we've moved away from that to more activity models like this one. So we typically say it's a conventional model. But activity models like this one are used to describe how we move around an area. And there's lots of things that go into it. It starts off with describing the region and sort of how individuals in that region describe their space or feel about their space. And that's the whole kind of theme for this. We look at individuals and how they move around. And figuring out that process of a day involves an iterative process. You can see all the kind of looping that goes on here, where we start off with mandatory activities. So if you think about your day, you probably woke up this morning and thought, okay, I have to be at work at a certain time. That would be your mandatory activities, and you figured out all the characteristics to get you to and from work. then you're going to start worrying about coordinated tours. Is there anyone in my household that I need to coordinate with? Maybe you have a kid that you need to pick up, drop off at daycare along the way. And finally, you get to add in your discretionary tours. And this is a generally accepted method of how we break down, both in our minds, behaviorally, our days, but also it works very well for modeling. And we can take all of our data and come up with this process and predict what's going to happen both today and in the future. And eventually the last part brings us back to that 2035 projection like in Auburn for a network assignment to figure out the congestion on different roadways. Now my question here is, how do we accurately include long-distance travel in this process? And I'm going to argue that it doesn't fit at all. That everything that we've had before doesn't accommodate this long-distance travel. And we need a new methodology to deal with this. So that's good for me, right? Gives me a lot of research opportunities. But I broke it down into 4 major ways that we can improve our understanding of long-distance travel and our ways about going to do that. So we'll break them down. The first has to do with new data collection. As I mentioned, there are some older surveys that collect this information, and that's what a lot of my work was done with in the past. 1995 was the last time the US had any sort of comprehensive long-distance travel data collection, which is shocking. I mean, a lot's changed since 1995. Places across Europe actually do a phenomenal job of collecting this annually. I was at an Australian conference this past summer and talking to people about long-distance overnight travel, and they were kind of nonchalant about, oh yeah, we collect this all the time. It's not necessarily in great detail, but they have an idea of where people are moving, especially between countries, every year. But the 1995 is unique in that it was the only time that we've looked annually. People were contacted 4 times during the year to kind of retrospectively look back at the last quarter of their long-distance trips, which were defined then as 50 miles or more. So that was a very unique thing, but it didn't look at geographies. It sort of just said, did you go somewhere and how far did you go? They weren't concerned about destinations or things like that. There was an update in 2001 where they came back and had some of this, but it was a 4-week time frame that people had their daily travel survey, and then there was a retrospective of what did you do for the past 4 weeks? Did you take any trips over 50 miles or more? So it's a bit more limited. We don't know what they did over the entire time frame. And so it's hard to work with all of that. If you think about long-distance travel, is the past 4 weeks representative of what you did for long-distance travel over the year? It's not so much. I'd argue that we need to consider the year time frame because the way that we all schedule these trips is different. We may be taking similar trips, but the way that we space them out is not necessarily a 4-week period is going to define what that is for the entire year. So we need a much longer time frame, which is where the LSOT came into play. What we did with the LSOT was contacted people over a year time frame with a monthly contact. Every month they'd get an email from us. We really focused on the geography of it, and I'll show you an example of how we accomplished that with the survey. And the planning aspect of this was important as well, as we're starting to get into in some of the research questions of not just saying, okay, for the past 4 weeks, what did you do, but how far in advance are you planning these things? What's the process that you're using to identify when to take these trips, to see if there's a different pattern to developing these trips than you would see on a daily basis, for example. So the survey that we did for LSOT consisted of a number of different phases. It started off by signing people up, and so this is my point where I can say, we're not allowed to ask if you guys participated or not, but we have many, many wonderful participants that were involved in our survey throughout the entire year. So we are incredibly grateful of everyone that was involved in it. We had a huge percentage from Vermont, although the Alabamans like it when I tell them that they kind of won in terms of numbers. But, but I do have to say that Vermonters were very dedicated compared to Alabamers. So it went through this whole phase, and after the first month, they just kept getting repeated surveys every month to ask, had they taken any more trips, had they planned any more trips, what was completed, and they could update all of their information. What was really unique about it was, this is a screen capture of part of a survey, where we had an interactive map. So each time that you took a trip, or technically a tour, you would record where you would start, where you would stop along the way and spend time overnight at each of these different locations. So we got a really good picture of where people were moving around over the course of their activities. This is a nice diagram to show off where a lot of the responses were, and you can see clusters very much in Vermont, in Alabama, and in California, where we had a lot of focused outreach to get people involved in the survey itself. But there are a lot of folks across the country, and even some in Canada, although I don't know that we're using a ton of them in our calculations for US analysis. But one of the things that we did was looking at this process. If we're trying to improve the way that we do things, to look at long-distance travel, we need to look at how we can recruit people differently. And I mentioned going to Australia. This was one of the big themes of that one, looking at, and we presented on how different methods worked to recruit people for this type of survey in the US. So we talked to a number of different people. Vermont had a neighborhood newsletter, which I'm totally blanking on the name. It's the
Front Porch Forum.
Thank you, that was it. Auburn had very strict rules about who we could contact and who we could not contact. So state employees eventually will start off as one of our routes, but we were quickly told that was not allowed. So thankfully the university itself was a great resource to allow us to reach out to people connected to the university in some way. But you can see the response rates for the different categories across here. And the best ones, of course, were ones where we had some sort of contact with these people, not just a blind connection, that they either understood what was going on or met them face to face or something like that. Well, here's the retention rate over time, and each month we start off with about 1,200 responses, or respondents, and then as time went on, we started to drop off, but we were amazed at how many people stuck with the survey over the entire 12 months. This was a great response rate for the entire 12 months as we went through, and there was kind of an initial drop off, but over the course of it, if you stuck with it, you stuck with it, which was great. Maybe it was just people who felt bad for us and wanted to make sure we were getting good data. But one of the important trends that came out from it was that within these trips, we thought, well, maybe people are traveling really far, doing lots of different trips, that it would start affecting how they were involved. But surprisingly, not many of them were very close to home. That we have those trips really short distances, and a lot of them were in these farther away distances. And what you can see here is that there's a definite trend towards mode and distance relationship, that the further away it is, the more you fall into the air mode. The really close ones, the in-state trips, people typically just stuck to their car, which we'll talk about at the very end. And I want to give you a sense of Vermont, of if you responded to our survey. This is kind of a trend where Vermont was across their movements in the country. And Chester gets amazing credit for this really nice graphic that's here. But you can see the little dots represent the different states, and the bigger the dot, the more trips that happened to those states from Vermont across the entire year. So you can see a lot happening in the northeast here and along the eastern corridor compared to it. And the demographics here are rather consistent across all the regions that we were with, but it's worth mentioning that our demographics here are a little skewed towards higher income, higher educated people, probably a little bit more mobile in what they're doing. You can see there's a large percentage of people with higher degrees here. But ironically, when we matched it back to the 2001 data, when we tried to scale them, the people that were making the most trips were those exact demographics. So even though we're a little biased towards those people, they're the ones making these travel anyway. I want to just give you a comparison. Here we have Alabama, and again, kind of a regional aspect. We stuck more to the southeast of everything. Not much activity up into the northeast from here, but rather consistent again, and a big emphasis on Auburn University as a source of people participating in the survey. Okay, so I mentioned that. So when it comes to response rates, we broke it down by how we reached these different people and what worked best. So anytime that we directly contacted somebody at a university, they kept the highest number of respondents throughout all of this. Friends and family was the next biggest category of somehow we had a personal connection to them and so far down the list. So what's more interesting actually is the next slide here of not just a volume, but what was the percentage that stuck with it until the end. And that's where we have the friends and family and the university newsletter were really the ones that worked best at keeping people towards the end. So again, some sort of personal contact. We did some Facebook connection through them, so even if we weren't talking to them personally, updating people with just information about what was going on was a good way to keep that contact going through. And then I really like this. I think this is an interesting thing, but I don't want to belabor the idea here. What we did is we looked at the number of completed trips and then when people started to drop off. So each line represents a group of people that dropped off in a different month in our survey. So the first one, the first dot right here represents the people that dropped off after the first month, and the last dot over here meant that those people stuck with us through the entire 12 months. And there's a little bit of noise in here, but I think that there's a pattern that for each time that someone, or a group of people, now granted some of these are very small groups, had a lot of activity going on in 1 month, they kind of got angsty about completing the survey and thought, okay, I'm done. This was a lot of work this month, and then they dropped off the next month along with it. So you can see this kind of pattern where there's a peak, for example, a peak here, and then they drop off the next month. There's a peak, and then they drop off. There's a peak, and then they drop off. So it's kind of this activity, and then I'm done. So, but you'll notice that there's a lot of people that are just consistently doing the same thing month and month, which is a lot of activity. So just because you do a lot of activity doesn't mean you're going to quit. And then another interesting thing was how much time it took for them to respond. So you can see that as the months were going on, we reduced the number of people that were completing the survey, but the percentages maintained about the same of how much time it took them to respond to the survey itself. Sometimes a reminder email was required, but it was pretty consistent as we went through. There was a slight dip in the middle of the survey, but I think that can be accounted for. It was summertime, so people were very busy, not necessarily sitting at their computer ready to fill out a survey. In fact, we did focus groups, which I'll mention in just a second, and people mentioned that they loved filling it out during work time. They'd get the email and then So we did model, be modeler. So we wanted to model the factors that were influencing each of these things. And so green, these are greens, represents the fact that a factor was positive, that it meant that they stuck with the survey a bit longer. The red means that they did not stick with it as long. So things not surprising in like recruitment group where we were having some sort of connection to people, which we saw in the retention rate diagrams, they stuck with us more, and things like the longer they took to start the survey, the less likely they were to stick with it through the very end, which kind of makes sense, kind of an indicator of that.
What's the vehicles? Why is that red?
This was the number of vehicles in the household. In terms of why that was a big factor, I'm not exactly sure. We didn't want to correlate this with the number of trips, but that may be related to it. So the fact that you have more vehicles in your household means that you're a bit more active, have a bit more mobility, and therefore less likely to stick with the survey because it was too much to include in there. But yeah, not an exact match up with that. And as I mentioned, we did some focus groups who, while we think it was a very successful survey, we got a lot of great information. There were a number of things that we got in feedback of how we can improve this to, if we do a next round or follow-ups to long-distance data collection. The first is this idea of repeat travel, which I'll come back to. That commuters and those who travel for work, we need to incorporate that somehow. There are many people, especially in the Southeast, that were traveling more than an hour to get to work. They live, for example, in Auburn and work in Montgomery or Birmingham, which are both more than an hour or 2 hours away. And that was just a repeat trip they were doing over and over and over. So we need to somehow account for that because it got kind of onerous for them to complete it. Moving homes was an important one. The presence of pets really dictated whether people were taking trips and the type of travel they were doing. My parents, for example, have a dog, and when they travel, they're very conscious of flying because obviously Sunny, their dog, can't come with them. But when they come visit, sometimes they'll actually drive down to Alabama with Sunny in the car, and they'll stay at hotels to along the way. So important piece. And then the other one that I wanted to mention here is this 50-mile limit. We focused on overnight travel as part of the LSOT, but we did ask a few questions about 50 miles, and I want to iterate, this is a hard threshold for people to think about, that if you just tell them 50 miles, we're not very good at identifying how far 50 miles is. So even though that's something that we use or have used since 1995 and 2001 in all of these surveys, it may not be the best measure of these types of trips. Okay, so that's kind of a background of all the things in the data collection that we may need to improve. But the second thing we need to focus on are these motivational factors of how long distance and overnight travel is different from our daily travel patterns. And so we kind of talked about the process of mandatory work trips, coordinating with people, and then our discretionary leisure activities. I think with long distance overnight travel, they fall into two unique categories. We have work travel. And if you think about, even if you didn't take the survey, take a second to think about all of your overnight long distance trips that you make over the year. And split them into the work trips and then into the leisure trips. Well, we found out, even from our focus groups and from literature, that work overnight and long distance trips are kind of dictated by the industry that you're in. You may have a certain job that sends you to certain places where you have hubs of activity. Those would be your geographic activity hubs. But we found that there's a lot of seasonal issues, that each industry kind of has their own structure of, like when projects start, and so you may have a kickoff meeting and then a wrap-up meeting, or you need to meet with clients at different times of the year. And depending on what your industry was, they have those different start and end dates, which may influence how they organize their year. Again, that 4-week period is not going to cut it. But in terms of kind of motivational things, they're not so flexible. And what we also found was, because work is kind of paying for it, costs are not as driving a factor in whether you fly or drive or things like that. Speed and efficiency, getting you back home after the meeting, is more important. Now let's think about leisure. With these, there's a number of different factors that are going on. And this is a big field within kind of the tourism side of things. We have different households have different thresholds. Great example of this is well studied with kids. The more kids you have in your household, the more stuck you are to kind of a school schedule. You can't take these leisure trips outside of breaks in the school schedule, which gets into the seasonal timing. We've got summer break, which is a big time for travel, but the holidays are also big for leisure travel. We didn't collect it in the LSOT, although we really think there's a big connection to social networks. Where your family and friends reside is going to influence these leisure type trips. And people are sometimes flexible. There are certain things where you have to be there for an activity, family reunion, but just visiting or going to be on vacation are a bit more flexible, and you can define when they're going to be. Now there's a number of motivating kind of psychological factors that we need to incorporate if we're going to do a good job of predicting how these things are going to change. The first is this idea of optimal arousal, which says that if we are looking at our entire year, that we don't just want to do one thing. We like to have a variety of activities to look forward to participate in over that year time frame. That we're not, people in general don't just focus, they like to have a variety of things. However, there's a second layer to this, which is satiation limits, where we say that, okay, there's actually, while we do enjoy doing different things, there's a limit to how much we can do before we get burned out on that, and that's satiation. We get satiated on whatever that is. So it may be, I have a friend who loves mountain biking and travels across the Southeast to do mountain biking, but there's a limit to how much he can do during the year, and usually by the end of the year he gets a little burned out from doing it, especially after the summer season when he's been traveling almost every weekend to do it. And then finally, there's a third layer, which is this activity specialization. And I like to use the mountain biking example, because while he does have a limit to it, he is demonstrating this focusing, that you may have a variety of things, but we tend to pick something that we're either really good at or really enjoy, and we emphasize it more over anything else. And so you may have a certain thing. I have photography friends that love to go on vacation and take photographs, so they're overemphasizing or specializing in that type of activity too. So there's some interesting trends going on psychologically in how we break up and schedule each of these different things. And along with it are repeat travel patterns, where repeating travel for work especially is very important. And I want to throw in this idea. I've done a little bit of work looking at a connection between daily travel and long distance travel. That what you do on a daily basis may influence what you do on a long distance basis. So we do some things of substitution. Great examples are if you are visiting friends and relatives on a daily basis, you tend not to do it when you go on vacation. But we do have specialization, where on a daily basis, if you're doing hiking or outdoor activity, if you go to the gym a lot, you tend to do more of that when you go on long distance or overnight trips. So we see those types of patterns too, and identifying how people react is really important. Okay, my third improvement is when it comes to scheduling components. This is an idea where how we break down each of our trips is important. And it kind of ties in the idea of optimal arousal, satiation, and specialization. The idea here is that you can think about all of the travel that you do during a year, and in order to maximize all those different activities, you're going to have different categories that you'll add trips to. And there's a limit to the number of trips that you can do. Obviously, there's only so many days in a year. If you were traveling every day, that'd be a little ridiculous, but theoretically that's the upper limit. Could be number of vacation days that you have, plus weekends. And then once you figure out those different allocations of time and tours, you can then break them up into where you're going to go and when you're going to travel between them. And that's that last step here of when you actually put them together and where you're going to head to. Now, one of the things that I did with this was looking at an annual activity schedule. This was back a couple of years, working with the 1995 American Travel Survey. This was the entire year, and it was a MDCEV, Multiple Discrete Continuous Extreme Value Model. And the idea here was that we looked at modeling how much time each person in the survey spent in each of these 5 different leisure activities. So it could be 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, and so forth. So you'd have an entire budget. And all of these factors over here turned into the green ones are the ones that significantly improved across the board for each of these. That the higher your income, the more likely you were to participate and spend more time in each of these categories. These categories, the older you were, the more younger children you had, across the board, across these different categories, you'd spend less time doing them. And of course there were minor variations where, for example, the older people really disliked the recreation one. But there are 2 stars here, which is really interesting. When it came to income, we built in satiation parameters that you may be expanding it, but there's also this burnout effect that's going on. There's a little bit of burnout too. And the major categories were income and age. So when income came into play, you really got burned out quickly on vacation and sightseeing, which is an interesting trend that if you're going to do that, you do it to a certain extent, then you start going off to other things because you have more flexible income for it. And age, I mentioned that they really disliked the recreation. Well, that came out really big in satiation as well. That any kind of this recreation and entertainment they weren't interested in, but it was really minimal satiation for them when it came to relaxing and vacation. They really enjoyed just kind of going somewhere and sitting on the beach. So, an interesting trend to looking at this annual schedule. The other thing is that we've started digging into the LSOT itself and looking at if we had to come up with trends in how people schedule distances, how you break up distances. So what we did is, if you're familiar with the cluster analysis, it essentially takes all of the travel and says, okay, let's find common groups of people. I'm calling them suites of people here, just to use a different name. But these groups of people do different things. So what we have for each, there's 5 total that we found. These are the number of trips that they took on average for people in this group for different distances away from home. So we're trying to get away from this 50-mile thing of looking at kind of a distribution rather than a threshold. So for this one, so we have this number of trips. Our second one is the number of kid trips. So you're traveling with children for each of these different distances. And the final one is the percentage of work trips that you're making at different percentages. So we threw in, I have to tell you, we threw in like 15 different factors, and these were the 3 that really stuck and showed us interesting trends. So you can probably identify which one of these 5 you fall into. So the first one, across the board, just had the most trips in general. They were making more trips across all the far distances. The second one emphasized the kids, that they were really taking kids far distances. The third one, you can see kind of follows a normal curve for both of these. So they have kids, but they're traveling kind of closer to home, but they are getting out and about to do those different things, but work is not so important for them. The fourth one really emphasizes the workers. Yeah, they've got a lot here, some kid travel, but they emphasize most really far trip distances. So these are the jet setters that are running around in the airport with the business class things, exactly. And then finally the last one is people that really aren't traveling for work. They probably don't have kids. We dug a little bit into the demographics of this. These are the more retired, older people, but they are taking a good number of trips compared to everybody else too. So an interesting way to kind of distinguish across distances people are traveling for purposes. And the second thing that I looked at was mode choice. And we're doing actually this with the ACRP system, that's Airport Cooperative Research Program, where we're looking at, across the year, how do people choose between different modes. And what we have here, I realize there's a lot on this slide, but it's pretty straightforward. We took every person in our sample, and the y-axis is the percentage of their work trips that were by air. So theoretically, if you took all of your work trips by air, you'd be in that 1 category. And then all the leisure trips, what proportion of your leisure trips were by air? So again, if all of your leisure trips were by air, which there's nobody, well, there were a few actually, you'd fall into a 1. And if you fall exactly on the axis, it meant that these people took no work trips, ever, or overnight trips in our survey. These folks only took work overnight trips in our survey. They had no leisure trips. And then everyone in the middle here represents kind of a mixture, where you had some work, some leisure, and split up between those different things. Well, some interesting trends with this that I want to highlight, that this upper category represents more than 60% of our sample. And so if you kind of draw the diagonal along here, it means that we're overemphasizing air travel for work trips. That of these people, the majority of people in our sample were predominantly using air for work travel and not so much for leisure. And this little group right down here is actually about 40% of our sample, and they're the ones that have no work trips at all and are just traveling for leisure. And you can see the whole spectrum of about 50% or less is the majority are using air for that. So it's a really interesting trend of how we're incorporating air modes into our long distance trips. And the last categorization that I did was with these groups of modes. And so here we have fun names for these because we presented it to ACRP. But again, we sort of did clusters, so you can identify yourself in these categories. And we have everything from regional roamers, who are those people that never use air, they're just traveling around their localized area, and across a spectrum to focused flyers. And those are people that are just diehard every time they get out of their house to do an overnight trip, they're hopping in a plane to do it. So there's only 4 of them, but it was a very unique group of people, what they were doing. So we broke it up by all these different categories. You can see, for example, here that the focused flyers were just going really far every time that they went on an overnight trip. Okay, and then my last thought here is with our behavioral framework. This is where we come back to taking in all of these different trends that I've presented and tying them back into that daily framework, right? The mandatory, discretionary, coordinated trips just aren't going to cut it. So we are still working on this. This is kind of a work in progress, but I think it gets to some of those overarching ideas where we need to start off by looking at, okay, what's important to each person? Where do they live? Where's their social network? Where's their job locations? All of that. And then when it comes into the annual overnight travel, we need to figure out how, instead of going mandatory, coordinated, discretionary, we need to figure out for them how they're prioritizing different types of trips. And we're starting to get into it by looking at these distances, the modes, the purposes, things like that. But we still need to figure out what's most important to you. So think about when you take a trip, or when you're starting to plan all of your overnight trips, which ones do you schedule first and why? Well, we recognize there are work tours, and they're going to follow a very different pattern of setup, that when you have your work tours, you go to your destination, do your thing, and then come home, most likely. So they have all those attributes, and then have kind of a spatial distribution. Then we have our personal business, which is everything of, well, I guess we included medical type trips in there, things that are mandatory. So we can argue that going to a wedding might be personal business because it's a dedicated thing that you have to do. So they have definite rules and how they fit in. And finally, we have our leisure tours, and these are the most flexible ones where you're doing some sort of specialized activity across the board. Now, we can't say that each one of these happens individually, because when you start defining work tours, it may influence leisure tours and vice versa. And that's why the looping here to kind of an iterative process to evaluate these things is going to be important when we start forecasting how these go. And I had one thought here that, great, now that we have this whole new framework, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to give it to DOTs to work with? This has been my discussion with the Alabama DOT. Is we start off with our regional characteristics, and I think that our daily travel measures, how we go about coming up with our daily travel, is related to the long distance and overnight travel that we need to do. So understanding how our region operates on a day will feed into how it operates on overnight travel. So it's kind of like a multiple step method for this, and I'll explain in just one second. And then finally, using both of these together is where you really get that full picture of where the traffic congestion is, predicting where people are moving. And if you want to do analyses about future conditions, where to build new roads, what kind of policies to implement to promote traveling by intercity rail is a big one that's going on right now, that's where you can analyze it. But it's only when you look at these two things together that you can truly appreciate the impacts. Okay, so my final thoughts here is that the LSOT itself was, I think, very successful in collecting information that was missing in the world of travel surveys and travel demand modeling. And the 1 year works really well to capture the wide range and the decision-making process that we use for these types of travel. And it's important to designate overnight, long distance, and daily travel, whether it is by survey or even in the modeling process. And when it comes to forecasting this overnight or long distance travel, the tours need to be looked at an individual level. Because if you think about your process for figuring out work, leisure, personal business travel, it's going to be very different than mine and everyone else's. So that prioritization is really focused on an individual level. And I think one of the key things that needs to come out of this is how we integrate it with daily regional models. That we've made some connections between personal travel on a day and long distance travel, but we need to expand it a bit more. And my final kind of takeaway thought, that as you mull over this for the rest of the day, is thinking about what system of long distance and overnight travel best serves society. And this is an interesting thought that as we get into the what-if scenarios, how can we best allocate funds and development projects and new infrastructure, whether it's promoting air travel or promoting intercity rail, that's going to support the kind of safe, efficient movement of people, but also benefit our quality of life, that we have all these issues as well. Okay, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. That's a quick overview, I don't know, quick, but a full overview of everything that we've done working towards this framework of long distance travel. Yeah.
Do you think automating the trip collection process using like smartphones or software will increase maybe where those people drop off, like get a little bit more data out of them because it takes the burden off of them?
From a survey perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. So the question is it better to do kind of a mobile, quick response survey, or our online survey which contacted them once a month? So it's a balance. When we did our focus groups, some people loved the fact, and they did the survey and told us that they would have just kept doing it had we continued going on, and they loved collecting all that information. So I think they would have loved an app version of a mobile collection of this, because maybe they saw the value or it was interesting to them. But there was another big group that said, you know, we didn't mind doing the monthly, but we definitely didn't want to do more than monthly. We were happy with that. And so the challenge with the mobile app, and it's something we're talking about, thinking about better ways to collect this information, is what's too much contact? That burnout could happen sooner simply because of the iterations that you're getting contacted. So there's a nice happy medium of how often to collect that information and how much information that you collect too. So our survey that we did online was a bit lengthy. It had lots of mapping questions and stuff. So if we were going to contact them using a mobile device, we'd have to be careful not to have too many questions.
Can I follow up on that too?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of thinking of like the new phenomenon of people wearing like jawbones and all of these like personal information systems. Were people who were really interested in it because you were giving them kind of more real-time data, or they were able to like monitor their data a little bit more real-time, or?
That's a great question. The benefit that they were getting from it, you know, we really didn't talk too much about like what did you perceive as the benefits, but people brought it up, and it's funny thinking back to those focus groups. It was the people that were most excited about participating, that when they showed up, they really brought with them their giant physical calendar because they knew instantly what was going on, and they liked being organized, and it, sort of like the survey helped them stay organized. So it was almost an organizational tool for them, and apps like that do exist, so if we could tap into that data, it'd be fantastic. So there may be a special group of people that like wearing the tracker things that see a benefit for them. I don't know if it will work for everybody, but there's definitely an organized group that would love that. Yeah.
Do you feel that America has overbuilt our air infrastructure? Just to give you an out-of-the-box question.
Yeah. The air serves a really good purpose. And we see that it's sort of the 5 to 8 hour trip or tour is where people shift from driving themselves to taking an air mode to get to their destination. I don't think we need to start removing air as an option for things. I think it works really well for that. So I'm not sure what you're...
Well, let me follow up on that. How does that compare, since you've had a chance to look at the European system and data and so forth, to a European system? Is it that 5 to 8, or is it, when they choose air, is it farther out in terms of...
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, so the ideas of comparing to the Europe is a challenging one because the people that are living in Europe have so many more mode options available to them.
Right.
And so I'd argue it's more a mobility issue, that as we're getting into more mega regions and social networks are more expanded than they've ever been before, to allow people to reach those groups of people, we need to offer the different modes to them. So Europe, as an example, it's more expensive to drive over there, so that becomes a less appealing option compared to rail and air, which are cheaper. But they have more options and shorter distances to get between them, so they have more of those choices to go through. In the US, we're not designed around large rail systems to get people to and from different areas, so air has become kind of a de facto, if you're traveling far distances, it's how people get around. So I would argue mobility in my mind is the key thing here, that if we're going to promote quality of life as a form of mobility, I think we need to support air as the way to do it. So that's the main mode that we're offering in the US.
I have a comment because you sort of started out your presentation by saying, oh, in Alabama, it's about making sure we have the road capacity and lane capacity to deal with this sort of increase in movement of people. And isn't that an outdated way of thinking about congestion mitigation? I mean, I lived in Atlanta for 6 years, and they kept adding lanes, and then they kept filling it up as soon as they added them. So why is the discussion more about moving people in better ways versus just adding more pavement?
It is a great question. And I think it's a challenge that a lot of states are dealing with because for the longest time we've been focused on building new infrastructure, right? It's the way that we've done things. And even in Alabama, we've done a number of commuter rail studies. So the folks that are living in Auburn who want to work in Birmingham or Montgomery, we've done those studies to figure out, would it make sense to put a light rail system, or excuse me, a heavy rail system connecting these major city areas. We actually have the right-of-way between the different interstates, so it would make sense to stick something in like that. Funding can be a challenge for those big projects, and it also could be a regional thing where in Alabama, a lot of people love using their personal vehicles to get around. So building a system like that and then showing that enough people would switch over to use that to justify that cost is the challenge. So they've done a number of feasibility studies trying to prove that this could work, but demonstrating that there's that inherent desire and benefit that it would come through it is a challenge.
It's sort of a chicken and egg, though,
Exactly.
right? Because you don't know if they prefer their vehicle. I mean, they could definitely prefer their vehicle, but because there's no better options available. And you could look at something like a dedicated bus rapid transit system in the short term that's way less expensive, see how popular that gets, and then invest later in something harder.
You're exactly correct. Yeah, it's something that I know is being talked about. It's just a matter of convincing the decision makers and the funding allocators that it's a gung ho move to make. Yeah, but it's a great
But
question.
you get to be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Well, and arguably, there can be a better conversation if there's data.
Right.
Right.
So-
It's kind of interesting that when you do look at the state model, so I kind of mentioned the regional models here, but there are state versions of these models. And Alabama still uses the 4-step method, which is trip generation, trip distribution, mode split, and traffic assignment. We technically don't use a 4-step method, we actually use a 3-step method because they've removed the mode split completely from the statewide model. They assume 100% of the travel is going via personal vehicle. So I agree that having this discussion about you need to consider more potential options to get around is a really important one.
And is the reason why you only discussed air and vehicle travel because bus and train were so small?
Like today,
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, the mode discussion I was giving here was funded through ACRP. So their emphasis was on the mode of air. Like they really wanted to know how people were using that as part of their annual process. So that was kind of why we emphasized that more than anything else. But truthfully, we don't have the rail and bus options in great length across the country. So it was a very small portion of all of our responses from it. I mean, we did analyze it, and it's just not part of this. But they were so small compared to anything that it was hard to make any statistically grand conclusions about them. Yeah. And again, it's the chicken and egg. Like, it'd be great to kind of do hypothetical analyses to say, okay, what if this was available? Would you switch?
I don't know, sort of hard
Last question, I'm watching the
implications
clock.
question. So, like, when we're trying to put this in a policy context, is it safe or reasonable to assume that there is utility gain from every additional trip or additional mile? Or do we need to somehow incorporate an element into our research that's saying, was this trip worth it?
Boy, Chester, that's a loaded question. Okay, so it gets into the idea, I think that's an important question because it gets into our spatial distribution of how things are laid out within a region, right? And I've done work with accessibility, where you're looking at not just are you able to get to what's around you, but are you getting to stuff that you want to get to that's around you? And so if something isn't very close, like you want to, I'll use the mountain biking example, if you really were into mountain biking and there's nothing near you, your quality of life would be better if you had access to those things that were, well, if you'd have to take an overnight or long distance trip to get to it, so that would be an important thing. But I think that's a motivation of understanding, look at your region, collect the data on long distance travel to say, okay, where are people going and why? What are they doing in these overnight long distance trips? And is there any way that we can redevelop land closer, that'd be a more sustainable growth type thing, say, okay, what is it that that we need to bring to the region to keep you kind of doing your thing within here, and maybe you don't need to fly or take a rail or take a bus to go somewhere. It would work better for a city development. But that being said, with this whole kind of daily long distance analysis, sometimes you want to get away from your core area. Like the fact that you are not in the metro limits adds something to that activity. So there's like the mountain biking example. You want to mountain bike in your weekends around there, but you want to have those specialization type activities that are outside, and the fact that you're going somewhere extra for it adds something to the quality of that trip.
All right, with that, it is 1:05, and I will thank Jeff very much for coming and thank all you for being here.